to PA Centered, a podcast designed to help listeners be a part of the solution to end sexual harassment, abuse, and assault. Each episode, we will take on a topic or current event to help spark conversation and break down barriers to building communities free from sexual violence.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the PA Centered podcast hosted by the Pennsylvania Coalition to Advance Respect, also known as PCAR. My name is Cody Henry. I'm the Communication and Policy Specialist at PCAR. Today, I'm joined by Julia Holtemeyer, the Resource and Training Specialist at the Stalking Prevention Awareness and Resource Center, also known as SPARC. Today, we will be expanding on our stalking podcast that was done prior. Julia, thanks so much for being on the show. Before we begin, I wanted to take a moment to let our listeners know that SPARC has shared a ton of great resources for this episode. Be sure to check the show notes for them. SPARC dedicates a lot of time to defining stalking and identifying behaviors. So I think it'd be best to start with that. So, Julia, could you start by defining what stalking is and how does it differ from behaviors that might seem similar but aren't actually stalking?
Yes, definitely. And thank you so much for having me and having a conversation about stalking, because SPARC exists to elevate the conversation. We are lucky enough to be funded by the Department of Justice Office on Violence Against Women to help the helpers. So we don't do any direct victim services, but we support all the professionals who are working to help stalking victims and survivors. And the question of defining what stalking is, you're right, we talk about it a lot. It's always where we start, of course, because a lot of people don't have a good understanding of what stalking is and wouldn't be able to just shout out a definition. And that's because a whole lot of different behaviors can be part of stalking. So it's not a simple definition like a burglary or property damage. It can cover a wide range of behaviors. So we talk about stalking's definition as being either the legal, statutory, criminal definition, if someone is going is thinking of criminal stalking and a charge through the criminal justice system. And then there's also the behavioral definition, and that's what we always start with and what I want to focus on, because behaviorally, it's important to be able to identify stalking anytime it might be happening, whether or not it meets the actual criminal definition or whether someone can get a stalking injunction or protective order, because those have their own definitions and thresholds. And stalking is a crime across the U.S., federally, in all 50 states and every single U.S. territory. And if you have any experience with our legal systems, you know that each jurisdiction defines things its own way. So we don't literally have 50 definitions of stalking, but basically each criminal definition of stalking is its own. So that's why we like to focus on the behavioral definition. And I will say it once for you all, and then since it's not super clear, I will talk about it a little bit. So stalking is a pattern of behavior directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear for their own safety, the safety of others, or suffer substantial emotional distress. So there are three big pieces to that long, complicated definition, which sounds very complicated, but isn't really that complicated once you break it down and talk about it in normal words. So the pattern of behavior, that first thing is that also called a course of conduct, but a pattern of behavior or course of conduct just means that stalking is not a single incident. So it's not a one-off phone call or one incident of harassment or one creepy thing that happens. It's a pattern. So more than one, two or more. And then it has to be directed at a specific person, which means a general crime of property damage to a random business would not be considered stalking. Someone putting a camera in a locker room to watch people undress, that's bad behavior. That's a crime, but that's not stalking. Unless someone is putting that camera in the locker room to watch a specific person. So stalking is always directed at a specific person, though stalkers frequently do things to other people in their target's life, all in order to get at that primary target. And then the last piece of that stalking definition is fear. So fear for somebody's safety, the safety of others, or substantial emotional distress. And fear is really what separates stalking from harassment. There's certainly some gray area between stalking and bullying and harassment, and how things are defined behaviorally and criminally. It would differ a little bit, but fear and emotional distress is a really big piece of what separates stalking from harassment and other behaviors. So if you have more than one incident directed at a specific person and there's fear involved that the victim feels or that a reasonable person in the victim's shoes would feel, we call that stalking. And so any type of behaviors, phone calls, text messages, emails, showing up uninvited, monitoring someone's social media activity, asking friends and family, colleagues, neighbors for information about the victims, those all could be stalking. There's no one behavior. And stalkers tend to be really creative individuals who come up with ways to stalk their victims that I would never have come up with. I have heard lots of just wild stories about things stalkers do, from signing their victim up for literally hundreds of email subscriptions, like from Bath and Body Works to cruise lines. So the victim gets hundreds of emails from those businesses, to driving hundreds of miles to carve a heart and their initials into the tree near the victim's new address. I mean, there's just, yeah, I can see your face. It's that you hear these things and you go, what now? Who they came up with? What? So it can be tricky to identify stalking because it's again, it's not like property damage. It's not a simple one question to determine whether or not stalking is happening. It's a really broad range of behaviors. And that's why, as you said at the beginning, we talk about stalking behaviors instead of just stalking. And really important also to think about when considering stalking behaviors and stalking more generally is that fear and emotional distress depend on context. So we always talk about how context is key, because some people are scared of spiders. Some people literally have tarantulas as pets. So, someone, to one person, a spider could be part of a stalking pattern of behavior that would cause them fear. To another person, it could be a lovely birthday gift. So you got to know the context to know if there's fear involved or not. And in addition to what a person actually fears, there's also a whole discussion around trauma and trauma responses. And if people are minimizing what's happening to them in order to get along with their daily life, then they might not be saying they're fearful. They might not be willing to show fear. But if they have changed their route to work, or changed their phone number, or blocked this person on social media, or asked their work for a change in schedule, or to walk someone to their car, or to not give out any information about them, to take their contact information down from their employer's website. Those are all signs of fear, even though a victim might be saying, no, I'm not in fear. I'm angry, or I'm upset, or I'm going to get back at them. But we can see from their actions that there are signs of fear and emotional distress.
Okay. And so when it comes to that fear aspect, I think, is that why it's not just a one-off type of thing? Like they have to understand that it's a fearful response. So you need at least that second one.
Oh, interesting. I haven't thought about it that way. I think it's more that we have different words for single incident crimes that cause fear, and stalking is a pattern generally over time. So if someone, of course, we all know that it is that if we're going to talk about sexual assault and rape, most victims of sexual assault and rape know their victims, but occasionally there is a stranger who jumps out of the bushes and rapes someone one time. think we would all agree that that person would be in fear. But if that's literally the only time that that victim and rapist have contact, then it's a single incident and you'd still have fear. But if in that example, the offender contacted the victim after the rape and was threatening them about going to the police or saying, or threatening to do it again, or threatening to assault someone else in their family, then we would have a pattern of behavior directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person fear.
You kind of touched a little bit on the next question, but let's flesh it out a little bit. How can someone identify if what they're experiencing or witnessing might be stalking?
This is a big, big thing that we talk about because so many different behaviors can count as stalking. So what we like to do to identify stalking behaviors and what we recommend professionals and friends and family do when supporting victims is to think about stalking behaviors in a few different categories. So we use what we call the SLY framework developed by Dr. T.K. Logan, who's a fabulous partner of SPARCs. And she came up with this framework of breaking down stalking behaviors into 4 categories: surveillance, life invasion, intimidation, and interference through sabotage or attack. So the first letter of each of those 4 words or buckets of behaviors spell out SLII, which conveniently is also a nice way to remember that stalkers are creepy, sly, SLY, criminals, offenders who are very creative and often very good at towing the line and making it seem to outsiders like what they're doing is no big deal, or maybe is even friendly or romantic, or how or why is a victim going to call the police for getting an Amazon package gift delivered of a stuffed animal spider? That's a pretty hard thing to call 911 about because you have to explain, well, I'm terrified of spiders, and this one time I got bit by a spider, and then I was in the hospital, so I know this is a threat from this particular person threatening to put me in the hospital. To everyone else, it's just kind of a weird gift, like, oh, I guess you like spiders, unless you get the full context from them, right? So, and most people wouldn't think to ask if we're talking about stalking. They're not going to say, hey, have you gotten a gift of a spider lately? That's not on most people's list of questions to ask. So breaking down stalking behaviors into these 4 categories allows us to ask questions to get the big picture and to get some of the context in a more methodical way. So asking, are you being surveilled? Has your life been invaded? Have you been intimidated? Have you experienced life interference? But of course, those are kind of the 4 big questions. And then there are lots and lots of sub-questions to ask, for example, about surveillance. Online monitoring, asking friends and family for questions, literally using a video camera or audio recording device, someone showing up where you go bowling every Wednesday, or your favorite yoga class, or waiting for you outside of class in college, showing up at your office hours if you're a professor. So what we have on our website, stalkingawareness.org, is lots and lots of questions that folks can ask when they're talking with victims, broken into these 4 different categories. So generally we say, start off by asking about those 4, start off with big picture questions, 4 questions, asking about each of those 4 categories, but then following up if there's any discussion of yes, or, well, I'm not really sure if this counts, but then we have lots and lots of sub-questions asking about specific surveillance behaviors or specific ways that a stalker might have invaded this person's life and shown up in their life. Same with intimidation and interference through sabotage or attack. And another really important piece about identifying stalking behaviors is that stalking behaviors themselves might be crimes or they might not be crimes. So someone might use sexual assault in their stalking pattern of behavior. Sexual assault is clearly its own crime. Or property damage. They might do that in the course of the stalking pattern, but also sending someone a gift off Amazon or texting them 100 times or showing up at their gym. Those aren't crimes by themselves. But if they're part of a stalking criminal pattern of behavior, then every single incident in that criminal pattern becomes a crime. So suddenly it is a crime to call them 100 times or to show up at their gym because it's all part of that stalking criminal course of conduct. But of course, that depends on your jurisdiction and the criminal definition of stalking. Also really important to remember that, so kind of as I was just saying, stalking can be part of a series of other crimes, and also other crimes can be part of a stalking pattern. So like witness intimidation is a pretty common thing that we see. And so if someone's goal is basically intimidating a witness and they're putting that person in fear, then that's both witness intimidation and a stalking pattern of behavior, assuming it is a pattern. But like to go back to my example of the sexual assault and a single incident versus following up with the victim afterwards, the witness intimidation is kind of part of the stalking pattern of behavior. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
So, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I follow you.
Okay, great. Yeah. So we often say, like, if you think about domestic violence, particularly if you're looking at intimate partner violence, frequently it is a pattern of behavior directed at a specific person. And would a reasonable person feel fear and suffer emotional distress? It's not all the time, but pretty frequently it would cause a reasonable person fear. And so stalking is often part of the power and control, the coercive tactics used to try to manipulate and control someone in a domestic violence or intimate partner violence situation. Similarly, if we look at human trafficking, it's often a pattern of behavior directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person fear. Sometimes we see that overlap of multiple crimes being committed as part of a stalking course of conduct, and also stalking as being used as one of the tactics within other types of power and control.
Okay, interesting. You mentioned a little bit about romanticizing it. So my next question is, movies and TV shows often portray stalking as a form of romantic persistence. I'm sure we can all think of a movie that we've seen recently where it was really cute that he was being creepy.
Right.
How does this cultural portrayal affect people's understanding of stalking in real life?
Yeah, I would say it is hugely impactful. And most portrayals of stalking as romantic persistence in movies and TV shows, stalking usually is shown as, or I should say stalking behaviors are shown as romantic, or ultimately you just have to persist long enough to get the girl. And it turns out well. But if you, as you said, think about a common or a rom-com that you saw recently,
Yeah.
and really think about, what if those behaviors happened in real life? Twilight, if you actually woke up and someone you knew was watching you from the corner of your room, even if they are your life partner, spouse, love of your life, that would still be creepy.
Yeah. Yeah. I would have something to say.
What are you doing there? And, like Sex and the City, see a lot of stalking behaviors. Even SpongeBob SquarePants, he has absolutely no boundaries with his friends. He is, should I always forget that friend's name, but his grumpy friend. He's always bugging. Yes, I think so. I mean, he really wants to talk to his friend, and just like while his friend is in the shower, he just like goes over and starts talking to him. Like, no, dude, you can't do that. What do you have some boundaries? And he absolutely doesn't take no for an answer. Like, that's not good. I think we would all agree. But that's, and I don't want to say that it's a bad thing to like those movies or TV shows, because I don't think it is. It's, their movies and TV shows are often an escape from reality, and they're fun and a lot of people enjoy them, and that's totally fine. The problem is that the only ways we see stalking behaviors portrayed are romantic, funny, heroic, or edgy. We don't see that the reality of stalking behaviors. We only are seeing these myths, and we're left with this fantasy version of stalking that trivializes, minimizes, and doesn't show the realities of stalking behaviors. And that leaves us as a society without a good understanding of what stalking is. And so when a victim is experiencing stalking, or a friend, a family member, even professional responders are responding to a stalking victim and talking with them, we have this societal understanding of stalking where we are more likely to say, oh, I bet he's just being awkward. He just really likes you. That's why he's texting you so many times. We're seeing it through this rom-com lens instead of through the criminal, traumatic, dangerous lens of the realities of stalking. And we actually do see there's some research done that people's frameworks for how they understand something, their cultural understanding of stalking and other crimes, of course, affects how and if they report. So victims are thinking about what a real, quote unquote, or legitimate, quote unquote, crime looks like, and then that impacts their reporting. And so if our real version of stalking is actually our quote unquote real version of stalking that we think of doesn't include stalking behaviors, it's more this image of a stranger following someone down the street at night. Yes, that does happen, but it's actually not very common. These perceptions of what stalking is affects reporting and response, and also the portrayal and our kind of cultural understanding of stalking through rom-coms being nice and romantic and not stalking behaviors similarly affects our ability to name something as stalking. And we find in our work across the country that victims are pretty unlikely to use the word stalking, even though I would identify what is happening to them as stalking. And if we also find that if you directly ask a victim, are you being stalked? They're likely to say no. But then if I ask specific questions about is this person monitoring your online activity, gathering information about you online or through friends or family? Do they show up when you haven't invited them? Are they creating new phone numbers and accounts to message you after you block them? All of, going through those slide behavior questions that we were talking about earlier, suddenly it's a yes, oh yeah, they do that too, oh yeah, and then this other thing happened. And I'm like, okay, well, if I take the information you're giving me and think about my understanding of stalking, I'm going to put the label of stalking on this situation. Even though that initial question of are you being stalked, the victim says no. And that's victims, friends and family, responders. We see it kind of throughout the country, no matter who you are, what your job is. We really see that the understanding of stalking culturally is this fantastical version of stalking, not the realities of it. And most people are stalked by someone they know, current or former intimate partners, friends, acquaintances, kind of colleagues, roommates. It's a little bit, again, like the myth of sexual assault, a stranger jumping out of the bushes with a knife and assaulting someone. It does happen, absolutely. But most people, it's someone they know who are victimizing them. And in addition to that, kind of not understanding the realities of it, of who's perpetrating it and what the behaviors are, there's also a misunderstanding of stalking as being not that big of a deal, like a rom-com, not taking no for an answer, going to keep asking her out. stalking is actually a red flag of a potentially urgent, dangerous, and volatile situation. It is criminal, traumatic, and dangerous, but we generally, as a society, have an understanding of stalking that's much more lighthearted. And I think media, movies and TV show have a lot to do with that because, again, it's okay to like those movies, but that's the only perception of stalking, portrayal and perception of stalking that's out there.
Okay. And then with the media kind of watering it down, what about normal people using the term stalking very loosely? Like saying I was stalking your Instagram or something like that. How does that casual use of the term affect real victims and societal understanding of stalking?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up because that is, I think, goes hand in hand with the movie and TV show portrayal of stalking, and the casual use of stalking in everyday language, I think really shows how we don't take stalking seriously and how lighthearted we think it is. Because I certainly used to use stalking like this, and I hear people use it all the time. I was at the gym recently and overheard people talking about stalking. Oh, is it okay if I post this on social media? You know, like, sorry, I was already stalking you. I know your handle. And I was like, I'm not at work right now, but do I say something or not? And I would encourage you all to now kind of be ready to hear it and think about it and think about other words you can use and correcting people, because it really does trivialize stalking. And for victims, that's pretty tough on victims for them to hear that their criminal, traumatic, dangerous situation is being trivialized like that. You know, there's no other crime really that we would use the word for a traumatic crime instead of like in a lighthearted conversation. And it isn't stalking. If someone says to you, or you find yourself saying to someone, like, oh my gosh, I was totally Facebook stalking you. I saw you went to Mexico. Like, the beach was so beautiful. Well, no, if that person is posting their photos online, and you are friends with them online, and their response is, oh, great, I'm so glad. Yeah, it was fun. Like, we should go sometime. That's not stalking. They are sharing their pictures with their friends and family, and it's not a pattern of behavior directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person fear or emotional distress. So instead of using stalking, think about other words you could use. You could say, I looked you up on social media. I saw your pictures. I was following you. I was reading up or asking about this thing. Or, if someone is being a little bit obsessive and saying, like, oh, sorry, I was stalking you and already know all about your new job or this vacation you went on. Instead of saying stalking, say, oh, maybe talk about coming on too strong, or I can't get enough of your photos and posts. I'm really into you. I was obsessed with your vacation. I can't stop thinking about it.
Mm-hmm.
Other ways kind of people talking about use stalking to mean excessively contacting, which certainly can be a stalking behavior. But if this is between friends, talking about maybe using words like bothering you, being annoying, nagging you, bugging you, following, looking for, looking into, but really think about, there are a million other words in English that we can use besides stalking.
Yeah.
And to reserve stalking for that criminal, traumatic, and dangerous victimization that it really is.
Okay. So then you've kind of also touched on this a little bit, but who are the typical perpetrators of stalking? And like what kind of relationships or scenarios does stalking most often occur in?
Yeah, I have mentioned that a little bit, but I'm glad that you're bringing it up to talk about explicitly, because there are a few big things to know. So the vast, vast majority of stalkers know their victims. The majority of victims report that their stalker is a man. If we're looking at all stalker-victim relationships, we see that about 40% are current or former intimate partners, which leaves 60% that are not. So it's important to look beyond domestic violence as a place stalking is occurring. If we look at data broken down by female and male victims, there's not a lot of data on stalking victims and offenders that isn't broken out by that binary. So if we are looking at female and male victims, we see for females, 43% report that their stalker is a current or former intimate partner, and 41% it's an acquaintance. So that's very similar percentages. And if we're looking at male victims, we actually see more, 44% are reporting that it's an acquaintance, and 32 are reporting that it's a current or former intimate partner. And those are the biggest groups. There are also family members, brief encounters, strangers, but those are the two really big categories. And the stalking, what stalking looks like varies a ton because there are so many stalking behaviors that creative stalkers can come up with. But really common ones that we see for stalking victims are unwanted phone calls, approaching a victim in person, or showing up at the grocery store, at the gym, at their work, waiting for them outside of class, either in person or online, following and just watching from a distance, gathering information. Text messages and emails are really big. Also, sending gifts, cards, letters are a common tactic. And one that kind of surprised me when I started doing this work at how common it was is stalkers sneaking into the victim's home or car and leaving a sign of their presence. So sneaking into, that would be property invasion if we're going for the crime. But I've heard a lot of stories about stalkers breaking into a car and leaving a beer bottle cap, or leaving a coffee with, the victim's name on it and prepared the way they like it, or breaking into their house and turning the TV on to the channel that the stalker liked to watch, and they would kind of always argue about because the victim wanted to watch something else. And all of these, the thing that these all have in common, I would say, is basically a way to mess with the victim, to say, hey, this is your personal space. I can get in here whenever I want. Think about the threat that is. I can get to you whenever I want. And I'm here. I'm in your life. No matter how much you've tried to get away from me, I can break into your car. I can break into your house. And also all of those, as another thing I mentioned before, but it's pretty hard for a victim to pick up the phone and call the police or call a victim service provider and say, hey, I'm freaking out right now because all the lights are on in my house.
Mm-hmm. Or my ex just bought me coffee and left it in my car.
Right. Yeah. And it's like, that doesn't seem scary until you know the context. And of course, victims are often hit with a lot of questions like, well, are you sure you didn't leave your car unlocked? Are you sure you didn't leave your back door unlocked? If all the lights are on and you can control that from an app, are you sure you didn't just, I don't know what the butt dial equivalent is of accidentally turning all the lights on in your house, but that. So it's that both the stalker and the victim know very clearly what the property invasion my ex buying me coffee, what that means. But then to have to explain the full context to someone of why that's so terrifying, first we have to give victims the opportunity for that. And also victims have to be comfortable enough coherent, comfortable enough to explain that. And think about how vulnerable they have to be to say, well, the beer bottle cap really stressed me out because I've been sober for 2 years and I'm in AA. And now this person who you're talking to now knows that you are in AA and how long you've been sober. And, it's just, it requires the victim to be very vulnerable. And there's often a high cost, especially if you think of a small knit community, a rural community where maybe the person, the dispatcher who you are calling, or if you're that dispatcher's child's teacher, like, I mean, if you go to church with them and now suddenly you have to share with them that you are in AA in order for them to take your stalking crime seriously, like there can be a lot of high costs to victims to sharing the full context of the situation. And that's even after getting over the hurdle of, am I going to call and report that someone left me a coffee in my car or on my front stoop? Like, who's going to take me seriously if I do that?
Yeah. So then, if someone suspects like a friend or family member being stalked, what's the best way without escalating the situation to kind of help them out?
That's a really great question. So on our website, we do have a short video and we have a little one-page sheet of recommendations. So you don't have to memorize this. Anyone who's listening, you can go find that. But the big things that we would recommend is, first of all, don't question or minimize what they say. So not saying things like, oh, I bet they just really like you, or, they're just having a hard time getting over the breakup, or, well, it just seems like they're being a little bit awkward. Don't say things like that. Don't question what they're experiencing. Listen to what they're saying and focus on the offender's behaviors. So, like, I can see why that would be upsetting. That sounds scary. It's not right that they keep texting you. Instead of focusing on the victim's behaviors and saying, well, why'd you respond to that text message if you're so scared? Keep the focus on, yep, I can see why that would be upsetting, scary. Let's talk about it. It's not right that they keep doing these things. And then I would also say help them think through options, places to get help, documenting all the different incidents. We have a stalking incident and behavior log on our website that anyone can freely use to just jot down the basics of what happened, when it happened, where it happened, if they reported it, if there's any type of evidence, but not, this documentation log would not have any place for how the victim felt. Victims tend to not forget how something made them feel, but they might forget who they told or where exactly something happened or what day of the week it was. And that documentation log can be really helpful for victims realizing the extent of the situation, and also for victims when working with victim service providers or the criminal or civil legal system to say, hey, look at all these things that have been happening to me, to show the pattern. And the reason we always recommend that the victim's thoughts and feelings do not get written down there is because if a victim ever did share that documentation log with a court or police or prosecutor, that would then become evidence, and the offender, the stalker, would be able to see it in court one day. And so we wouldn't want them to have evidence of what really freaks their victim out. Just a simple list of incidents. Also really important, supporting a friend, family member, coworker being stalked is to respect their privacy, because their privacy has probably been violated as part of the stalking, and their boundaries have been violated. So not to share the stories or the information, to always ask the victim before talking about the stalking, and even to start thinking about, okay, well, if someone asks me for an update on my friend and I say, oh yeah, they just got a new job, is that person going to then go tell another mutual friend who's actually the stalker? So really protecting the victim's privacy and respecting that. And I would also say, doing research to help that friend or family member figure out who locally in the community can help them. So there are lots of victim service providers, because often, if you're a friend or family member, you are probably not an expert in stalking. So you can support that person, but also figure out who else is around who can professionally support them, who has training in safety planning, who would be able to talk through legal options, protection orders, criminal stalking, other crimes that have been committed as part of the stalking. And around the country, there are a few, but almost zero stalking service providers. But domestic violence and sexual violence and crime victim service providers will generally help stalking victims, domestic violence, even if there's no intimate partner violence that's part of the stalking, your stalker is a stranger or a friend or a roommate, that service provider may still support the stalking victim. So domestic violence and sexual assault service providers are generally the place to start to ask, hey, if my roommate is stalking me or an ex-colleague is stalking me, will you still help me?
Okay. We talk a lot about like the interpersonal aspect of stalking. Let's shift over into like the legal aspect a little bit. I don't expect you to know all 50 states or anything like that. But like, what should someone understand about the legal side, like including protective orders when they seek help? Like what's something that they should keep in mind?
So the big thing to remember is that each jurisdiction has its own definitions for criminal stalking and for protection orders. So each one is different, but the big things to keep in mind are that there's always going to be a pattern of behavior or course of conduct. There's always going to be fear and or emotional distress. Things that differ by statute are generally the offender intent. If the stalker has to intend to place the victim in fear, or if they should have known that what they were doing would put a victim in fear is enough. So different levels of legal criminal intent. And also some statutes require that the victim feel fear. Some only require that a reasonable person would feel fear. And so it's breaking down your criminal statute, getting some legal help. There are a lot of legal advocates at DV, domestic violence and sexual assault organizations that can help. Also, I would say especially for offender intent or a victim feeling fear, that reasonable person feeling fear, police, law enforcement, prosecutors do investigations all the time to figure out what was this criminal's intent. We have different laws for if the driver of a car hits a pedestrian with their car. We have different crimes for if they did that intentionally, if it was a complete accident, or if they should have known that they were driving recklessly and could endanger someone. So it's not unusual for police and prosecutors and judges to determine that level of intent. What they tend to not have a lot of training on is how to apply that to stalking situations. But there's nothing all that different about the definitions of stalking as a crime compared to the rest of the criminal system. It's just that training has to be applied in a way when it's often not trained. People aren't often trained in that way or thought of in that way. Protection orders are, so different jurisdictions use different names. They're sometimes called protective orders, protection orders, protection from abuse orders. And a lot of people associate protective orders with domestic violence, but many jurisdictions issue protective orders, especially for domestic violence. And some of them do it for stalking, some do for sexual assault, some do for, harassment. Basically, it depends on your jurisdiction, which one your situation would fall under, because sometimes a person stalking situation, if there are other crimes or other victimizations happening that maybe don't rise to the level of a crime, they might be eligible for two different types of protection orders. And then they would have to decide, okay, well, what's the difference between them? Which one am I more likely to get? And what are the possible restrictions on the offender that the protective order could enforce? What would be most beneficial? Some jurisdictions have protective orders specifically for stalking. Often they're called stalking injunction orders, but sometimes those are only for non-intimate partner situations, because there's a separate DVPO that stalking would fall under as part of the domestic violence protection order. So all that to say, as a general information, stalking is a crime in every jurisdiction. There are protection orders in every jurisdiction that a stalking situation could fit into, but each one is going to be different. And it's also important to remember that there are both civil and criminal protective orders. So a person can apply, usually a person can apply themselves for a protection order in civil court without ever going through a criminal stalking process, trying to charge someone with stalking. And also important to remember that if a stalker violates a protective order, it's really important for the victim to know how to report that and what to do, because in some jurisdictions, they report to the court that issued the order. In some, they call the police and report it. So that differs. But all protection orders, or actually, I shouldn't say all because there are so many different types of orders, but most protection orders have what is known as full faith and credit, which means they are enforceable and valid across the US. So I live in Minnesota. If I have a protective order against someone here, and then I go to Pennsylvania to visit my family, that protective order is still valid in Pennsylvania. And if it gets violated while I'm there because my stalker followed me, or I experienced stalking, whatever from that person the protective order is against while there, I can call Pennsylvania police, and they are then supposed to enforce it. It's kind of like a driver's license in that wherever your driver's license is from, you can drive in all the other states. And if you get pulled over, the officer who pulled you over is going to assume that your driver's license is still valid, basically.
Okay. For someone that's experiencing stalking, what are some effective steps they could take to protect themselves and respond safely? Like, should they go to the police right off the bat, or should they try something else?
I would say this is a very difficult question because every victim's experience is different.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that a victim, if they feel they are in immediate danger, certainly to consider calling 911. If they're not in immediate danger, consider if they want to report to the police. We don't have any good data on what gets stalkers to stop their behavior. What we tend to say is that stalkers are the only ones responsible for their behaviors, and they're making a decision to stalk. So a victim can't stop their stalker's behavior. They can certainly do things in their own lives to make themselves feel more safe, but they can't control what the stalker is or is not going to do. The limited research out there about stalking and protective orders in particular says that roughly 50% of the time, protective orders tend to stop the stalking behavior, which is great, but also means that 50% of the time, roughly, the stalker continues their behavior. So there's no silver bullet, but victims can work with professionals, victim advocates who are trained in safety planning to kind of think through the details of how is the stalker affecting my life, if there are certain locations or days, specific days and times when the stalking tends to escalate, if there are any triggering events, dates coming up, a court date or an anniversary or the end of the school year, something like that, that might change the stalker's behavior. And to think through if a victim decides to change their life, change their behavior in some way, how is the stalker likely to react? But victims ultimately have to decide how to live their life and how to balance their safety and freedom. Because some victims are going to live like hermits, and some are going to decide that they can't give up their that they can't give up their bowling league because it makes them so happy, and it's an important thing in their life, a way to connect with community, family, friends, etc. So it's important for victims to feel like there are steps they can take and to think through what they can do, but also to remember that they can't control the stalker or the stalker's behavior. And victims respond to stalking behaviors in a variety of ways. Some try reasoning with the stalkers to kind of placate them, hoping that being nice will make it stop. Some confront or threaten the stalker and try to fight back or do the same types of things back to the stalker. Some continue to communicate with the stalker in order to gauge how the stalker is feeling, and if they're at work or out drinking with their friends, if they're in the neighborhood or traveling, in order to manage their safety, to kind of know where their stalker is and what mood they're in at all times. I would also say that an important thing to consider for victims when thinking about what to do about it is to consider keeping a log, as I mentioned, that documentation log, and to save evidence when possible. Sometimes victims want to delete all the text messages or social media messages or accounts that keep asking to follow them, or all the hundreds of email subscriptions their stalker has signed them up for. Mm-hmm. And the victim might still decide that that's what they want to do, but also consider that that then gets rid of any evidence if they do want to go for a protective order or try to file criminal charges. So doing things like taking screenshots, making an email subfolder, and filing every single email from that stalker into that email subfolder. Maybe even if you're tech savvy enough, you can set it so that the messages automatically go into that subfolder and you never have to look at them. But saving evidence when possible is might be useful for the future. And we'll have them in the show notes, but there are some great resources out there, for example, for victims about technology safety and saving evidence that might be used in a court later, planning for safety and things to think about, kind of questions to go through to think about how and when does this person show up in my life? Are there any patterns? And what are ways I could, if I wanted to, change my life based on that stalker's behavior?
Okay, perfect. Well, that is about all the time we have for this episode. Is there anything else that you want to let our listeners know? You want to end on like a high note on anything?
Ooh, I mean, that would be great. I'm not sure I have a high note to end on, but SPARC, stalkingawareness.org is our website, and we have lots of resources for the helpers who help stalking victims. Again, we don't do direct services, but we have lots of guides, fact sheets, awareness posters, tons of stuff out there to help the helpers who are responding to stalking victims. I do just want to emphasize again that stalking is criminal, traumatic, and dangerous. It is important to take it seriously and raise awareness of it. And whether that's you stopping the use of Facebook stalking in your everyday life, calling other people out for it, or calling other people in for it and having a conversation about what stalking is. January is National Stalking Awareness Month, and we have tons of resources on our website for raising awareness. We have a playlist of creepy stalking songs that is basically just very popular songs. And if you ever listen to the words carefully, you realize they're creepy. We have short awareness videos that are great for, 2 or 3 minutes to explain why it's important to talk about stalking, or think about media representations of stalking, or how to help a friend or a loved one who's experiencing stalking. Yeah, and stalking can be very dangerous, can be very traumatic, can have long-term impacts on physical health as well as mental health. And so it's just really important to take it seriously. We often talk about how the way our field of victim response and society kind of thinks about stalking is like 20 years behind. So if you think about how folks talked about and responded to domestic violence 20 years ago, that's kind of where we are with stalking. But hey, SPARC exists, and you are having us on this podcast, and we have growing awareness of National Stalking Awareness Month in January every single year, and so the conversation is changing, and you all can be a part of it. That's my high note.
Nice.
We can all be part of the change. Be the change you wish to see in the world. Take stalking seriously, believe victims, hold offenders accountable for their actions. If you see someone engaging in stalking behaviors, think about if it's safe for you to talk to them about it. If someone in your life is experiencing stalking behaviors, they might not call it stalking. You could start that conversation. Next time you watch Sex and the City or Twilight or SpongeBob SquarePants, enjoy it and then have a conversation if you're watching with someone about how much fun it was and how it doesn't accurately portray the realities of stalking.
Yes, very much so. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time, Julia, and thank you to SPARC for letting you come on the show and give us a little rundown of stalking. This was amazing. I learned so much.
Thank you so much for having us.
No problem. No problem.
Any views or opinions expressed on PA Centered by staff or their guests are solely their own and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of PCAR or PCAR's funders.